I still remember the sound of the cafeteria clock ticking when my world caved in. Tick, tick, tick. The second hand sliced through the silence just before my boss, Greg, dropped the hammer. "Eli," he said, sliding a crisp envelope across the table. "We're letting you go. Effective immediately." At first, I thought it was a joke. I'd been with Northgate Systems for 7 years, built their entire back-end from scratch, trained half the IT department, and debugged the messes no one else dared touch. Greg wasn't just my boss. He was my mentor, my friend. We used to grab beers after late shifts and talk about how we'd retire rich once the company went public. But that day, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. I stared at the envelope, termination notice, stamped in red, and felt my pulse crash through my ribs. "Greg, what is this?" He sighed. "You've been great, Eli. But corporate's restructuring. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." That's what they always say before they stab you in the back. I wasn't just losing a job. I was losing everything I'd built. My pride, my security, my sense of worth. I'd poured years into that company. Missed birthdays. Missed my dad's funeral because a server migration went south and Greg said, "You're the only one who can fix this." And now I was disposable. The cafeteria around us buzzed with the hum of microwaves and gossip, but it all felt miles away. Greg's assistant, Cara, stood near the door, arms crossed, watching like a vulture. She'd joined the team only a year ago. Ambitious, quiet, always smiling that practiced smile. Greg had been spending more time with her lately. Late nights in his office. Whispers when I passed by. I didn't want to believe the rumors. But as Greg pushed back his chair and mumbled something about HR handling the formalities, I saw it, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Then he turned away. That was it. 7 years, gone before my sandwich got cold. As I packed my things, I caught my reflection in the break room window. The same guy, loyal, hardworking, stupidly trusting, staring back at me. I clenched my jaw. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just hollow. Greg thought I'd walk out quietly. He thought I'd disappear. But as I looked over my shoulder one last time, I noticed something odd. A faint glow from Greg's monitor through the glass wall of his office. Lines of code. My code. But it wasn't running on our usual server. Something wasn't right. And by dinner, they'd find out just how wrong things could get. I didn't go home right away after they fired me. I sat in my car, parked across from Northgate Systems, watching the glass tower I'd practically lived in for years. My keycard was already deactivated, but my brain wouldn't stop running through lines of code, my code, and the flicker I'd seen on Greg's monitor. It didn't make sense. The project I'd built, Erebus, wasn't supposed to be touched yet. It was a security framework still in testing, designed to detect breaches before they happened. If Greg or anyone else was running it outside our sandbox, it could crash the entire network. So why was it open on his screen? I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just showing it to investors. Maybe he'd meant to tell me before, firing me during lunch. Still, the doubts started to crawl in. When I got home, there was already an email waiting in my personal inbox. From Greg. The subject line read, "You'll understand soon." No message, just a single attachment. A PDF titled, "Confidential Agreement." I didn't open it. Not yet. Something about it felt off. The timestamp was strange too. Sent exactly 1 minute after my termination was logged in the HR system. Almost like he'd scheduled it. For the next few days, I tried to move on. But everywhere I went, Northgate haunted me. The constant buzz of Slack notifications I wasn't part of anymore, the empty space on my desk where my work laptop used to be, the silence from people I thought were my friends. Except Cara. She texted me the second night. I didn't know Greg was going to do that. I swear. Then, I think he's scared. Something big is happening. When I asked what she meant, she never replied. The next morning, I got a LinkedIn notification. Greg Whitman viewed your profile. Weird. Why would he be checking up on me 2 days after firing me? That was the moment the confusion started turning into something else. A dull ache of realization that maybe Greg hadn't just fired me to restructure. Maybe he wanted me gone. I opened the PDF that night. Most of it was standard non-disclosure jargon, but the last page made my stomach drop. My digital signature, copied from another document, already sat there in bold. Below it, a line I'd never written. I authorize Northgate Systems to assume ownership of the Erebus framework and all derivative work. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. My life's work, stolen, signed away without me. I wanted to believe it was a mistake. But deep down, I already knew. Greg's betrayal was just beginning to show its teeth. It hit me 3 days after the firing, the exact moment betrayal stopped being suspicion and became fact. I'd spent hours combing through backups of Erebus, trying to make sense of the fake signature, the missing test environments, the corrupted Git commits that seemed to rewrite themselves. Everything pointed back to one thing. Someone had cloned my private repository from an internal server that only 2 people had access to. Greg. And me. That night, I logged into my personal dev cloud, a habit I couldn't shake. I didn't expect to find anything. But when I opened my email, there was a notification from an old automated build tool I'd written years ago. It had just triggered itself. Project. Erebus_ Build initiated by c.maddox@northgate.com. Kara. For a full minute, I couldn't breathe. My hands shook over the keyboard as I watched the build logs roll by in real time. My code compiling, my architecture being spun up on Northgate servers. They'd stolen it. Both of them. Erebus wasn't just code, it was mine. The result of years of late nights, caffeine overdoses, and failed relationships. A predictive defense AI that could detect, isolate, and reverse engineer malware faster than anything on the market. It was supposed to be my legacy. And now, Greg and Kara were about to launch it under their own names. I found the press release an hour later on Northgate's staging site. Northgate Systems announces new breakthrough in cybersecurity, the Erebus engine. Greg was listed as lead architect. Kara as co-developer. My name, erased. Every part of me wanted to believe there was some mistake, that Greg would call and explain, tell me he just needed to get the project live before investors pulled out. But that illusion shattered when I saw the attached photo in the announcement draft. Greg and Kara, smiling under the Northgate banner, his arm around her shoulders. The same man who'd called me brother. The same woman who'd texted, I didn't know. I felt something inside me break. Quietly, cleanly, like glass under pressure. I sat there in the dim light of my apartment, the glow of my monitor flickering across the stack of empty takeout boxes, my own reflection staring back at me in the black screen. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even shaking. Just still. They thought they could erase me. They thought I'd walk away, defeated, silent. But I built Erebus to watch, to learn, to adapt. And I still had access, a backdoor Greg didn't know existed. I closed my eyes, took a long breath, and whispered to no one. You shouldn't have used my code. By dinner, they'd regret ever touching it. I didn't leave my apartment for 2 days. The blinds stayed shut, the phone stayed off, and the only sound was the low hum of my PC tower still running, like it refused to give up even when I had. The air smelled of cold coffee and exhaustion. Every line of code I'd ever written replayed in my head, tangled with Greg's voice. It's nothing personal, Eli. I kept thinking about how easily he'd said it. How easily they'd taken everything. By the second night, the anger had burned itself out, leaving only numbness. I felt weightless, like a ghost haunting his own life. Then something strange happened. I opened an old folder on my desktop, Archive, from my early years at Northgate. Inside was a video clip. My first presentation to the board, pitching Erebus before it even had a name. In the video, I was younger, nervous, and full of fire. I was talking about how code should protect people, not corporations. How trust isn't something you buy, it's something you build. I actually laughed when I heard myself say it. But the laugh cracked halfway through. Somewhere in that half-forgotten version of me, the idealist, the builder, the dreamer, I saw something Greg couldn't touch. That was the trigger. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was clarity. They didn't just steal my work. They tried to erase my name, my purpose, to pretend I never existed. And that, I realized, was their biggest mistake. Because if Erebus was my creation, then it still answered to me. I spent the next morning rebuilding myself, piece by piece. Shaved, showered, opened the windows. I brewed fresh coffee and powered on my rig. The familiar blue glow filled the room like the return of oxygen. I dug through my old development notes, tracing the hidden pathways only I knew, redundancies buried under layers of code, ghost processes designed for debugging that could easily become something else. For the first time since that lunch, I smiled. Not the bitter kind. The kind that said I'm not done yet. Greg thought firing me would make me powerless. Cora thought she could copy my code and I'd never notice. They forgot who built the foundation they stood on. I opened a new terminal window and typed one word. Initiate. The system came alive. My system. The heartbeat of Erebus thrummed back into existence, silent and unseen, connected to every node they controlled. I leaned back in my chair, eyes cold, steady. They wanted my legacy? They were about to get it. Every line, every byte, every consequence. You took my future, I whispered. Now I'll rewrite yours. And with that, the hunt began. Revenge, I learned, is an engineering problem. It needs requirements, a failsafe, and, most importantly, a timeline. So I stopped thinking like a hurt man and started thinking like the architect I'd always been. If I was going to destroy what they'd stolen, I couldn't look like a jealous ex-employee throwing a tantrum. I needed documents, timestamps, and witnesses. I spent 2 days assembling everything I had, archived commits, presentation drafts, old Slack threads where I'd sketched the original Erebus flowchart, build logs that still bore my fingerprints. I cataloged it all into a neat, unassailable package. Copies for a lawyer, copies for a reporter, and copies tucked away in places Greg would never imagine I'd use. There were people I'd helped up the ladder, engineers I'd mentored who still owed me favors. I reached out quietly, one late-night text to Marco, who'd left to join a rival firm, and a careful email to Priya, an investigative tech journalist I'd once given a story tip to. I kept it professional, proof, timelines, and one simple question. Can you verify this? They said yes. The weight of that yes was like adding fuel to a controlled burn. People underestimate optics. If Northgate's staging site went down by accident, it would be shrugged off. If their investors saw tampered release notes and internal discrepancies, their faith would wobble. So I built a narrative to accompany the technical chaos, a breadcrumb trail pointing to corporate malfeasance, backdated memos, and a few well-placed email threads that suggested the product was rushed to hide corners cut in security. All of it was true, just rearranged to show motive and negligence. I didn't need to teach anyone a new trick. I needed to use their hubris against them. I planted anomalies. Harmless-seeming monitoring flags, a few ghost processes that would trigger automated responses, and a mock hotfix in the staging environment that would force a cascade of defensive actions when activated. I made sure every alarm they relied on would be the very thing that amplified the failure. Throughout it all, I practiced restraint. The old me would have stormed in, screamed, and lost the upper hand. Now I moved with the composure of someone who knew the architecture better than they did. I wrote memos that looked like benign maintenance, set meeting invites that pulled Greg out of his office at exactly the right minute, and timed a casual Slack ping from a planted account to distract Cora during the window I needed. When Marco and Priya confirmed they were ready, Marco to monitor traffic and Priya to hold the story, something cold and quiet settled in my chest. This was no longer about being wronged. It was about accountability. About the truth being visible in a way they couldn't scrub. I sat alone in my dim room, watching the dashboard that had once been my pride. Lines of status lights blinked. Green. Stable. Confident. I pushed a single pre-scheduled message to an innocuous internal endpoint and closed my laptop. The plan was set. The stage was dressed. By dinner, their servers would be something else entirely. Everything moved like clockwork, because I'd built the clock. By late afternoon, Greg's calendar looked exactly as I'd planned. Back-to-back investor calls, a board briefing, and a staged demo with the press scheduled for 6 p.m. Cara was to lead the demo while Greg handled questions about scalability. Both would be off-site, exposed and dependent on the very systems they'd commandeered. At 5:15, Marco pinged me. Traffic looks normal. Staging clear. Priya's DM followed. Story goes live on my mark. Are you ready? I tapped my keyboard and deployed the first hook, a benign-seeming patch to the staging environment that quietly flipped several monitoring flags and queued an automated verification job. The job referenced a ghost process I'd left buried in Erebus years ago, a diagnostics routine that, when fed unexpected input, would begin a recursive rollback across dependent services. Harmless on its own. Dangerous when the right switches were flipped. I flipped them. Within 10 minutes, alerts cascaded through Northgate's ops channels. A single microservice failed, then another, then the auth gateway. Automated failovers kicked in, but my planted anomalies made them misroute traffic into stale caches. Investors on the first call heard nothing but static and repeated error tones. On the second call, an embarrassed SVP tried to improvise. His voice cracked as dashboards showed throughput dropping by 90%. At 5:50 p.m., Priya published a piece, a sharp, sourced expose laying out the timeline, the fake non-disclosure with my forged signature, build logs showing Kara initiating Erebus builds, and a leaked draft of the press release with my name wiped clean. She included quotes from Marco and other engineers who confirmed the architecture and ownership. The article hit the feeds, and the feeds hit the inboxes of every investor on every call. By 5:58, the press conference stream went live. Kara smiled into the camera, oblivious. Greg cleared his throat to speak. Then the lights went out, first on screen, then in the server room as redundant systems began tripping designed failsafes responding to the recursive rollbacks. The demo app failed to load. Live metrics displayed a scrolling wall of exceptions. Investors watching live saw the company hemorrhage credibility in real time. On the stream, Greg sputtered. He tried to pivot to talking points, but reporters were already flooding the chat with links to Priya's article. Questions about security, ethics, and the erased authorship came fast and brutal. Kara, face turning ashen, checked her phone and then looked at Greg with something like betrayal finally dawning on her. He had no answer. The board convened a crisis call that turned into chaos. Stock tickers that mattered to them blinked red. Legal teams scrambled. Overnight, their polished announcement pages were replaced by boilerplate maintenance notices. The Erebus staging site, the crown they'd put on their theft, sat like a ruined monument, unreachable. I watched from my window as the building's lobby emptied faster than usual. People I'd spent years mentoring walked out with the shocked, hollow eyes of those who'd been lied to. There was no dramatic arrest, no cinematic confession. Just silence. The kind that comes after the last slide of a presentation fails and everyone realizes the story has changed. I closed my laptop and let the quiet fill the room. The same quiet that had followed Greg's words in the cafeteria the day he handed me that envelope. Only now it felt different. Not hollow, but full. Full of consequence. Full of a truth that couldn't be scrubbed. By dinner, their servers were down. By midnight, their names were nowhere the press could scrub them clean. And in that silence, something in me settled. Not joy exactly, but a grim, steady peace. You said. The world didn't end for Greg and Cora overnight. It just unraveled. By the end of that week, Northgate Systems had issued a formal apology to investors, quietly scrubbed their Erebus announcement, and terminated 2 key executives pending investigation. Greg's face disappeared from the company site like he'd never existed. Cora's LinkedIn went private. The empire they'd built on stolen work crumbled exactly the way bad code does. Not with explosions, but with 1,000 small irreparable errors. Marco told me that the board tried to recover what was left of Erebus, but the rollback I'd triggered had done its job too well. Every stolen fragment was gone, reduced to meaningless data dust. The only functional version was the one still sitting on my encrypted drive. My version. The irony. They'd fired me for restructuring. Turns out, they were the ones restructured, out of existence. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no victory post. Just a quiet morning a few weeks later, sunlight spilling across my desk as I opened my laptop again. For the first time in months, the code on my screen didn't make me angry. It felt like breathing again. I rebuilt Erebus from scratch, stripped of their fingerprints, cleaner, sharper. A system designed not for corporations, but for small cybersecurity teams who couldn't afford the giants. I released it open source under a new name, Helios. Within days, engineers I'd never met were contributing to it. My inbox filled with messages from people thanking me for making security accessible. That's when I realized, revenge hadn't destroyed me, it had burned away everything false. As for Greg, word was he tried to start his own consulting firm, but nobody wanted to touch him. His investors had seen too much. The last update I heard was that he'd moved states, out of tech entirely. Cora vanished offline. Maybe she saw it coming. Maybe she finally understood what she'd helped break. I don't hate them anymore. I used to. But now they're just a lesson written in old code. Trust must be earned, and betrayal always leaves logs. That cafeteria moment, Greg sliding that envelope across the table, saying, "It's nothing personal." It replays in my mind sometimes. Only now, when I hear it, I smile. Because the truth is, it was never personal for him. But for me, it always was. And the beauty of poetic justice is this. They fired me during lunch. By dinner, their servers were down. And by morning, I'd rebuilt myself. If you've ever been betrayed by a friend, a partner, or a boss, tell me, how did you rise from it? Share your story in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, of pain turned into power, hit subscribe. The next one might just remind you, sometimes, the best revenge is rebuilding better.